Comorbidity. I was a late bloomer, but a few months ago, I finally moved out of my parents' house and started my adult experience proper. Microwaving Bob Evans macaroni and cheese bowls at any hour of the night without the beeps waking anyone up. Bringing myself to unabashed climax on the couch while watching How It's Made. The mass production of jelly donuts is erotic, and you goddamn well know it. Building my Lego forts in peace and quiet. The benefits are nigh indescribable. The only drawback has been losing touch with Alan. Alan invited himself into my life in late 1997, during my first year of high school. Having moved to a new neighborhood, he had no friends, and apparently the quiet, bespectacled teenager sitting by himself in the cafeteria was an attractive target. I was regaled from day one with story after story about video games. Now, I love video games about as much as anybody can, but his were the kind of "my uncle works at Nintendo" nonsense I'd assumed most of us had grown out of by that point. Over the next few weeks, we spoke constantly, whether I liked it or not. The confluence of our schedules was such that we had at least 42 uninterrupted minutes together every day. It was a bit much at first, but I couldn't bear to break off the friendship, and what we ended up going through is a story worth retelling. He'd recently been introduced to pot, you see, and naturally started combing through his house for a good place to stash his newfound accessories. It so happens that he stumbled across an existing hideaway in a corner of his room, under the floorboards, and the curious floppy disks concealed within are the subject of this particular post. As I recall, Alan couldn't get the disks, labeled MICWI, to read properly in his parents' Windows system. Only after an overbooked computer lab had him sitting at one Mac in our school did it occur to him why. He tried the disks in that, and lo and behold, was introduced to one of the most unorthodox games I've ever heard of. If you've ever played May I Come With You, that makes two of you. I've never had any computer classes with Alan, and they never let us out of lunch to use the lab, so his wide-eyed, breathless tales are the only exposure I've had to the game. As it stands, I can find no information about it. Google, message boards, friends, nothing. I'll still kick myself for not asking him to make me a copy. But enough of that. Let's get to the good stuff. As the story was related to me, the game was fairly run-of-the-mill at first glance. Top-down, Zelda-style adventure, set in a 2-story suburban home. Crude graphics, but they got the idea across. You controlled a girl in a yellow dress, and could explore the house to your heart's content, receiving occasional bits of descriptive text upon interacting with certain objects. This exploration revealed a few things that left the game feeling unfinished. 2 of them, the attic and the garage, neither being accessible. The attic hatch, in the second-floor linen closet, was apparently blocked by some heavy boxes, and the main character couldn't move them. I don't believe Alan ever made his way up there. The garage was a bit more dramatic, sending the game into a fit whenever you tried to use the door leading off of the kitchen. This had a tendency to freeze up the entire computer, which the teachers weren't terribly fond of, so experiments in that direction were nipped in the bud. Audio was apparently the game's strong point. There was a rather imposing hulk of a furnace in the basement, and upon examining it, deep rumble started up and lasted for most of your gameplay. Combined with the music, which I recognized as Ravel's Bolero when Alan whistled a section, the experience was at least a delight for one sense. At that point in the game, the exploration was little more than something to kill time. The real fun, if you can call it that, didn't start until you approached the front door. You couldn't go outside, instead receiving the memorable dialogue box. Appease them, please them, or they'll knock you to your knees then. Alan relayed the message, and of course, the 2 of us giggled like idiots, but we were never able to figure out just what it meant. It was the trigger, however, for the game's central conceit. Every few minutes, as if on autopilot, You'd be brought at random to a part of the house. Tried to leave and you'd be forced right back into position until you realized you had to hit the action key to interact with something. Complete a given mind-numbing chore, opening and closing drawers, turning lights or faucets on and off, and a new dialog box pops up. An offer for the coffers? A blinking cursor underneath would sit there until you'd typed the right response. That response proved elusive, and it took a couple of days for us to work out the offering gimmick. Alan first tried searching the house for some sort of item he could serve up, but nothing presented itself as far as he could tell. The game didn't even have an inventory system. It seemed to come down to just guessing what to type, and we ultimately resorted to writing up a list of everything the girl could conceivably have on her person. Earrings and necklace were duds, but eyelash, of all things, bore fruit. Standing at a counter in the kitchen, a dialogue explained that the game's protagonist plucked out an eyelash and laid it inside the drawer she'd just been messing with. Further offers went along these lines. Correct answers, e.g., strand of hair, causing the girl to remove something from herself and place it somewhere in the house, behind the strike plate of the upstairs bathroom door. For some reason, the notion of literally making yourself at home fascinated Alan, and the damned game started to fill up all of his free time as he desperately pushed to see what would be sacrificed next. It threatened to barge into mine as well. It wasn't too bad for me, but we still spent so much of our time those days trying to come up with the appropriate offer for each situation that I barely started eating before the bell rang and lunch was over. Alan caught the brunt of it, though. The number of times you had to carry out the task at hand saw a dramatic increase. More and more of his time in the computer lab was being eaten up by this game, to the point that he missed a few major assignments and irritated the hell out of the students who needed to work on documents from their Macs at home. Luckily, by Christmas break, his sister had gotten her own Apple setup, and was eventually persuaded to let him use it. Here's where things got skewed a bit further off the beaten path. As said mind-numbing chores became even more so, the aforementioned gifts became what I'll delicately describe as increasingly unconventional. The call for certain bodily fluids made us uncomfortable, yes, but when it came time to pull out one of the girl's fingernails with a pair of pliers, we weren't so bothered by the previous demands. As soon as the unsavory act was done, there was a marked shift in tone. Alan likened the process to the death of a boss in Final Fantasy VI, but in lieu of victory fanfare, was what I'd later come to call a Silent Hill-style transformation. He described the look as oily, with scattered clumps of white pixels, highlights, suggesting a layer of slime built up on the environment, and everything taking on a generally grimy color palette. The air vents seen throughout the house glowed disconcertingly, and if you made your way to the basement, you'd see a red-hot, overworked furnace, whose more profound vocalizations set the screen shaking. The final three offers didn't take quite so much effort to discern as the earlier oddball ones did, but they were notably more extreme. The first was bad enough, and had the girl heading for a toolbox in the basement. Her pinkies didn't survive, and found a new home wedged inside the nearby electrical outlet box. The second, I later recalled on watching Saw for the first time. There was mention of a tourniquet, and your character limping about in a now crimson-speckled dress left a short trail of splotchy red ovals behind her as she headed over to the dining room, cut a hole in the wall, and tossed in the X appendage. The third, and final, was a significant step up from the others. As I mentioned earlier, the number of times you had to run through any given task had gone up, but apparently I'd underestimated the severity of it. The later offerings took Alan hours to run through, but for the last one, I didn't hear from him for over 3 days. Our vacation had ended on the second day, and he wasn't in school on the third. When he finally came back, looking sleep-deprived and dejected, he filled me in. It had taken the entirety of 3 days for him to travel up and down the main staircase, what must have been thousands of times, with only a few bathroom breaks and cat naps here and there. When it was all over, it was time for the last offering. Alan couldn't get in touch with me at the time, so he decided to tackle it himself. There were only so many body parts remaining on this poor woman anyway, so it was a simple matter of figuring things out. Once he'd done it, the right half of the screen stayed black until he'd finished playing. What was left of the image showed him that everything snapped back to normal once the offending orb had been set into its final resting place. The original environment returned, normal colors and no more oily sheen. The music also stopped, along with the furnace. Still in control of the girl, Alan steered her back downstairs to find the front door wide open, a pale orange trapezoid of light cutting sharply into the foyer. The entire experience wrapped up in one giant iron-gloved punch to the stomach. As soon as he tried to walk outside, the thing froze. There was a new piece of music, one I couldn't recognize no matter how many times Alan whistled it, and it had seemed to signify a new area. But whatever the developer's intent, it was all for naught. The screen stayed black. Nothing happened. The end. He seemed sickened by the whole experience, frankly, and with the flack he was catching for falling behind in school, he didn't really want to talk about it anymore. We stayed in touch through high school. Things tapered off in the following years, and once I moved out, that was basically the end of it. Now I'm the one in the new neighborhood, and I have yet to make any friends quite as unique as Alan was. Certainly none with stories like his. Should I learn anything more about the game, I'll be sure to post it here. Until then, everybody, check under your floorboards.
I think